Welcome to this session of the Hudson Institute Center for the Economics of the Internet. It's our very great pleasure to have with us today Ambassador David Gross. Before turning the program over to Ambassador Gross, just a couple of housekeeping matters. On February 13th, we're very pleased to have General Cartwright, recently Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who will be speaking on cyber warfare issues. On February 22nd, Professor Tom Hazlett, George Mason University, will be speaking on broadcast spectrum issues. We have some other speakers coming up in March, and I will keep those posted at the website. But today, we are extremely pleased to have with us today Ambassador David Gross. Ambassador Gross was at the State Department during the Bush administration and represented the United States on telecommunications issues throughout the world. We are very pleased to have Ambassador Gross with us today to speak about recent developments in Internet governance and related issues. Ambassador Gross will speak for perhaps half an hour or so, and then we'll open up the floor to some questions. Ambassador Gross.
Well, thank you very much. And is it okay for in the back if I stand up? I have to sit down. I hate always having to sit down. I feel like I'm in the negotiations now or something. So I apologize to all of you. I like to wander instead. So I'll sit down here. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a real honor to be at the Hudson Institute. There's a great, proud tradition here. Commissioner McDowell was here with you not too long ago, and I know he really enjoyed it, and he did, as usual, his great job on these things, so I hope I can do as well as he did for that. Although I noticed you gave him a fireside chat opportunity, and I'm going to have to speak more extemporaneously.
We can turn it into fireside chat if
you
like.
Well, I think maybe we'll probably end up doing something in the order of sort of a 3-act play here or something, although I hope it has a happy ending. And I hope it's not a comedy, too. We'll have to see, but not a tragedy either. I thought maybe in the first act I'd give you a little background, although looking at this crowd, most of you are living what we're about to talk about, so not a lot of background needed. In fact, it has some feel to a delegation meeting at the U.S. government here. But nevertheless, I'll give some background remarks as you indicated. Then I thought we'll probably have a little bit of a conversation, give the Commissioner an opportunity to be the first questioner on these things, and then open it up for questions and answers. I thought it might be important to begin with a bit of a disclaimer. And the disclaimer in this case is that I want to be really clear that when we talk about, that what I want to talk about is primarily the International Telecommunications Union, but the issues are, of course, broader and not exclusive to the ITU. That the issues of the Internet governance, issues that are related to Internet governance are very broad and are being discussed in a wide variety of forums on a continuing basis. I quickly add that I think that's an extraordinarily positive development. That is one of the characteristics, I think, that has been a hallmark of the United States since the early days of the Internet and predates the Internet itself, is an expectation, a willingness, and a desire that the entire world come along on the ride. And the ride being the use and innovation and economic and social and political benefits that come from free flow of information, from new and innovative technologies, that these not be limited to just the haves, but that they should be shared broadly, used broadly, and that the benefits, therefore, accrue very broadly. So along those lines, I think it's very important to think about this not just as an ITU matter, as important as the ITU is, but rather these issues are being discussed around the world, in countries, among civil society, the issues about the Internet, how it should be governed, how it should be used, what's wrong, what's right, how can things be better, are actively being discussed at the United Nations itself. The ITU, of course, is a part of the United Nations family, but In the United Nations, in New York, these matters get discussed. They get discussed at UNESCO, another UN-affiliated entity. They get discussed in regional bodies, at the OECD and elsewhere. So I want to make sure, sort of from the beginning, that I recognize and that we recognize for purposes of this conversation that although there's a tremendous amount of focus, and I will focus some particular attention on the ITU for a number of reasons, that this is not a conversation that's limited to that world at all. I think it's also very important to recognize when we talk a little bit about the ITU and these issues, about the importance of the International Telecommunications Union to the United States. In many regards, it's very easy to demonize international organizations and to, in so doing, forget some of the extraordinarily important and good work that's being done by them, including, in this particular case, by the ITU. As we sit here today, although I'm looking at the clock, I guess people are still sitting in Geneva because it's just early evening there, we have the World Radio Communications Conference happening. This is a once every 3 or 4 year event that underscores the extraordinary importance of the ITU to the United States. Again, economically, from a national security perspective, and from many other perspectives as well. The ITU is the place the world gathers to, among other things, decide how to allocate spectrum. And of course, everyone in this room understands the importance to their lives, to the economy, from a national security perspective, and otherwise, the issues about how spectrum is used, how it is distributed, how it is allocated, is extraordinarily important. And the ITU is, in my view, the indispensable place for those discussions. If we didn't have it, we'd have to invent it. The issues also in terms of the ITU that I think are important to keep in mind is that, and it ties very much into the discussions we're having about what should be regulated, what shouldn't be regulated, and by whom, is that the ITU has, particularly through its development sector, a part of the ITU that's of relatively recent origin, has done an extraordinarily effective and good job of advocating some of the core values that we in the United States see as important. The importance of liberalization, the importance of rule of law, the importance of having independent regulators and the like, has been a core part of their discussions with the world, and we see the tremendous benefits that have come not only from technical changes, but from those policy changes in which the ITU has played a very, very important role. It seems to me that without the ITU's advocacy, as well as the advocacy of many governments, including the United States, for many years and across many administrations, we would not be in the position we are today of looking around the world and seeing the extraordinary changes and developments that have occurred in telephony, internet, wireless telephony, and many other areas. It's just extraordinary to me when you look back over just a very recent period of time and think about where we are today. Back as when we were in the 80s, basically telephony was and telephone service in general was something really just for the developed world, for Europe, the United States, Japan, a few other countries. But it almost didn't exist in any serious way in most of the developing world. And the view back then was that it would be almost impossible for that to change because of the expense and the difficulties associated with it. You look at where we are today. Over 5 billion of the, 7 billion people on the earth now have a cell phone. So they don't only have telephony, they've got an access to the internet. They have, if they have a smartphone, they have an ability to talk with their family, their community, with people virtually anywhere in the world. That is a sea change that has happened because of the leadership of the United States, the leadership of other countries, and frankly the leadership of the ITU in trying to promote many of the policies that have been pro-growth, pro-liberalization, pro-privatization, and have benefited the people of the world in extraordinary ways. Now with that, that sort of preview, let me talk a little bit about internet governance and those issues broadly stated. Now let me give you also one additional disclaimer. We could probably spend, in fact I'm sure we could spend not only today but the rest of the year sitting here and talking about what the nature and the definition of internet governance is. I can assure you I have absolutely no interest in doing that, and I hope you don't either. When I use the term internet governance, I want to do so sort of in a broad and a fairly plastic way. And I really am not looking to get into a debate about where the lines drawn are. Back in the World Summit on the Information Society, which was the UN Heads of State Summit that was held in 2 phases, first in Geneva in 2003, and then somewhat ironically in retrospect in Tunisia in 2005, much of the discussion in 2003 amongst all the governments of the world, in essence, was about the meaning of internet governance. And let me tell you that today I don't think we know that term, define it any better than we did back then. We had a working group, something called the WIGIG, because everything's an acronym, of course, in diplomacy, as it is in telephony. And we had a working group on internet governance that was charged with defining the term internet governance. They went off and spent time and came up with a definition that I'm sure somebody in the world understands. I don't. And we brought it back in 2005 and referred to it merely as a working definition, because nobody wanted to say that it was not successful, because everything's always successful in international diplomacy, almost. But nevertheless, it's not a definition that I think lends itself to easy conversation. So in talking about internet governance, back in 2005, we saw a discussion that was really quite extraordinary. The world had really come in the early part of this century to understand that the internet was, in fact, extraordinarily important to their countries, to their governments, to their people. That in and of itself is a tremendous success for countries like the United States and others who have long and very successfully embraced the internet. Because, as is true for most network externality types of things, the more people that are on it, the more people that contribute to it, the more valuable it is to all of us. And we've seen, certainly in political and economic events of recent years, the extraordinary power of the internet and related technologies. Now, in 2003 and 2005 at the World Summit, there was a very vigorous fight over the nature of how the internet should be regulated. The United States and a number of other countries took the very strong position that the multi-stakeholder approach, that is, multi-stakeholder is, it refers to the fact that there are many players who are involved, the private sector, technical organizations, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, academics, and governments all have a role to play in this area. And therefore, there should not be any sort of supreme body, certainly no intergovernmental organization that should determine how the internet should be governed, almost no matter how that term is used. This was a very difficult fight. It was very vigorous. And those in the room, many of whom were part of that discussion, will recall those difficult days. But at the end of the day, when we had the summit in 2005, we had an international consensus, which the U.S. Joined with enthusiasm, in which we said that, in fact, that multi-stakeholder approach is the appropriate way to think about these issues, and that it's not for any group of countries to govern it in any sort of significant way. There was a reaffirmation about the role of the U.S. government, not quite expressed that directly, but it is clearly understood in the agreement that the unique role of the U.S. government vis-a-vis one of the groups that are involved in internet-related issues, in this case ICANN, ought to be continued, and that the stability and reliability of the internet, as a result, was of paramount importance. Not surprisingly, the conversations about how the internet should be governed in its myriad factions has continued ever since then. 2005 was an important watershed event. The summit itself was a unique, well, I don't know if you have two that are unique, but nevertheless, if you can, it was a unique set of meetings. But yet those discussions have continued. And I think, frankly, from my perspective, that is a good thing. I think it's always important to be re-looking, reanalyzing how we do things, that we have problems, in fact, if we just keep going the same way regardless, just because it is historically the way we've acted. The discussions about internet governance continue to pop up. As I mentioned at the beginning of my, my talk, these issues in various forms pop up in many places. They pop up at the UN itself. So for example, at the UN, there have been proposals, one fairly recently by India, in which they propose to have the UN itself act in some yet to be really fleshed out way to take at least part of the role that ICANN traditionally plays, and that ought to be done by the UN. And the UN, of course, is an intergovernmental organization. That is, governments are the ones that have the votes. Governments are the ones who have the say there, not a multi-stakeholder approach, even though there are aspects of the UN where multi-stakeholder conversations do occur. They take place in other organizations, as I mentioned, places like UNESCO and the like, and there are proposals to create new organizations to do this that would be, in essence, government run, government controlled. Sometimes these proposals are focused on things like cybersecurity. The Russians and the Chinese, for example, have put forward a proposal with a couple of other countries, and the Russians have been very active in this space. But I think right now there is increasing amounts of attention, and quite correctly so, on an upcoming treaty conference that will be held at, well, sponsored by the International Telecommunications Union, that will take place in December in Dubai. And this will be referred to as the WICET, which is the World Conference on International Telecommunications. It is designed to address the issue of whether or not the 1988 treaty that was agreed to at the ITU, known as that created the International Telecommunications Regulations, the ITRs, everything's an acronym, it is telecom, whether or not that should be revised, and if so, how it should be revised. I think it's fair to say that most countries that have weighed in so far have weighed in to say that they should be revised in some fashion, that not shockingly, that the international rules governing telephony in 1988 may not be as current today and for the future as they were at that time. This creates a number of challenges for everyone, it seems to me. One challenge is to think about these terms in terms of sort of classic internet governance related issues. The second set is to think about these issues in terms of internet-related issues, that is, things that are not directly seeking to regulate the internet in the sense I think that most people would use that term, but would have an impact on the cost or availability of internet access by people. And then the third are more traditional telephony-related issues, issues about price, availability, governance associated with who sets the rules for a telephone service, whether it's wireless or traditional wireline services and the like. So it's often very helpful to think about it in these terms. Now let me just spend a moment, if I can, before delving into that, and hopefully not too much into the weeds, by saying that my conversations and discussions and my listening to many others, particularly in the U.S. government on this subject, gives me great encouragement. I want to make sure that no one misperceives my comments today as being anything other than not only supportive of what the U.S. government has done, but also what it's going to do and what it's been talking about. I think the leadership shown so far by the U.S. government has, as it has for many years in a very bipartisan way, been really quite wonderful. I think of, for example, there was a speech recently given at another think tank, Brookings. I'm not sure I'm allowed to mention them here. But at Brookings by Assistant Secretary Larry Strickling, in which he discussed a number of these issues and really discussed the ITU, discussed the WICET coming up, the importance of it, the importance for making sure that we are, as a government and as an economy and as a people, prepared for these discussions with the rest of the world and how it would go forward. The FCC has been very active. In particular, Commissioner Robert McDowell has been very outspoken, having written a lot, having spoken on these issues as well. And my wonderful successor, Phil Revere, who has done, I think, just an extraordinary job, is very engaged and very focused on these things. And his team, as well as Larry's team and the team at the FCC, I know have been working very, very hard on these matters. But it's still, in some respects, both at the one hand early days, and on the other hand, the time is running very quickly. December is not that long from now, and particularly for a treaty writing conference, and the unique nature of this particular treaty writing conference, it's going to take lots of efforts by lots of people with lots of good thinking from the private sector, from NGOs, from academics, and of course with the leadership of the U.S. government as well as other like-minded governments to make sure that what happens in Dubai in December is in fact something that everyone can be proud of. Now let me talk a little bit, if I may, about the background in 1988, which is for many people in this room, not that long ago, and for most of you in this room, ancient history. 1988, in that period of time, it's often hard to really recall, but the United States and only a few other countries really were committed to what we refer to today as liberalization, privatization in terms of telephony, no less the internet. And the internet, in terms of from a commercial perspective, was really functionally non-existent. And then you think of where we are today. So when the world came together in Melbourne, Australia in 1988 to put together the ITRs, they struggled greatly. And that was a conference that all of the participants have told me, at least all the participants I've spoken with about this, have told me, was as close to a failure as you can get in a successful conference. It was not clear until the very end that, in fact, there would be an agreement. And at the core of the issue in those days was the issue of what would happen in the future, what would be permitted. Would we continue to have a world dominated by government-owned entities, or would we encourage private sector investment, private enterprise, the way we had in the United States and in a relatively few number of countries around the world? And of course, the decision was made to allow for that private agreements to be made. That has, of course, together with changes in technology and many other things, I don't want to make it look like it's all just because of this one agreement, but that one agreement was very important to establish that policy of liberalization as being an acceptable global phenomenon. And the impact it's had on the world is nothing short of spectacular. And we've, of course, been great beneficiaries of that. So as we discuss the ITRs at any revisions, it seems to me one of the primary principles, one of the primary issues that cuts across whether we're talking about the internet, telephony, or the like, is whether or not we stay committed, we as a world, stay committed to a policy of liberalization, private sector leadership, innovation, as we have lived through the past few years, or whether or not those in the rest of the world who seek to go backwards, who seek to have governmental control, to seek and use excuses, in my view, of problems as a way of reestablishing the primacy of governments over this space as a primary mover, is very much at stake. That is a very, very serious challenge for everyone. And it seems to me in dealing with the challenge, we need to be very concrete, very direct, and very responsive to the legitimate concerns and issues in the rest of the world. I believe very strongly that it is important to listen and to understand very well what are the real problems. And assuredly, as everyone would agree, there are real problems that need to be solved. And the question then becomes, who are the right actors? What are the right processes for those issues to be addressed? I would note, for example, that as I mentioned a moment ago, going on right now in Geneva is the World Radio Communications Conference. And one of the great issues that are being debated there is a very, very, I think, profound vision of whether or not people in Africa and in the Middle East, in the Arab region, will be allowed to allocate very valuable spectrum earlier than Europe wants to do it. Now, this is not a criticism of one side or the other, but it is because of some very technical, very important rules. Europe it's hard to believe, but Europe and Africa are tied together in regard to certain spectrum-related issues. So the interventions at the beginning of the WRC last week was really quite extraordinary. We heard from Africa, we heard from the Arab world about the importance of new technologies to their people. The ability, as they talked about it, of people, for their economies, for people to be connected, for people to be able to have the advantages of a modern telephony network, as well as access to the internet. I think that is a signal of some of the discussions we will have going forward in Dubai at the end of the year. What is the vision? Are we in this together? Are there ways in which we can be flexible? Now, flexibility doesn't mean, however, that we give up on core positions. Quite the opposite. And that's been a long-standing view of the U.S., that we believe that certain of our core principles are so important and so universal that they need to be maintained. And one of those core principles has been for a long period of time that the government and governments through international organizations should not control the pace of innovation, should not control the ability of people to have access to the internet, should not control, in another may-I fashion, the ability of the internet to grow, to change, and to benefit all of us. But those are sort of the issues that are on the table. Now let me be sort of a little bit clear on the subject that I think that has most people excited, which is the issue sort of internet governance writ large. The process for the ITRs, for the amendment of the ITRs, is a very strange, convoluted, and unclear process. To date, as we sit here right now, we have basically a number of proposals, ideas that have been set forth in very general terms to how they should be organized, how they should be changed. And so it's a little premature to come to any firm conclusions about what governments view ultimately as what is important and what is unimportant in changing these ITRs. But it does give us a bit of a preview. And at the end of this month, Marion Gordon and a team from the State Department, the FCC, NTIA, and others will be in Geneva discussing what the next phase of this will look like and the negotiations will look like as they have a preparatory meeting at the ITU to discuss these things. But I think there are certain things that have become clearer, at least to me, that are issues that are on the table that concern me. And we will see if ultimately that concern is well-based or premature. Without trying to name names, there are some, but I'm happy to do that later on if you like. Some countries have advocated for what appears to be very simple, updating certain things that look very easy but actually could have profound ramifications. So to give you one example, the term telecommunications is a defined term. It is, in essence, defined in a way that is telephony-focused. It only takes a couple words, a little tweaking, a little change here and there to bring it into the 21st century. It's about the future, to actually, without anybody really focusing on it, give the ITU, a treaty-based international organization, the ability to regulate in the area of the internet in the same way it has an impact on telephony. Now, let me also be clear, the ITU is not a regulator in the sense that we often use that term, like the FCC. It doesn't have classic enforcement authority. It doesn't have jurisdiction over domestic telephony, at least currently. It doesn't have a lot of those characteristics. But nevertheless, it is an organization that has tremendous authority by what it says, what it recommends, and how countries react to it. Similarly, some countries, in fact, some of the same countries, are very interested in having the ITU expand its jurisdiction in the area of cybersecurity. This was a very active discussion at the ITU now for many years, and the ITU has been very active in the area of cybersecurity, I think quite constructively and appropriately for many, many years, focusing on the network-related issues there. But some governments think that that's not enough, that it needs to be broadened, needs to be deepened. And of course, it doesn't take much imagination to see how a change in that area could have an impact in terms of the ability of the ITU to start to play a more significant role, regulatory role perhaps, in the area of cyber writ large, because cybersecurity itself is so important. I can continue to sort of tick down the list, but I think it's important for all of us to sort of say that we understand from our experience, from the documents that have been submitted so far, that the focus of the wicket is likely to be primarily on telephony-related issues. But we need collectively and individually to be prepared for the discussions which will occur, without doubt in my mind, about the role of the ITU with regard to the internet, either directly or indirectly. And you don't have to take my word for that. Prime Minister Putin, perhaps future president, former President Putin, when he visited the Secretary General of the ITU, made the case in comments that he saw the ITU playing a more important role with regard to the terms, at least as translated, of internet governance. Similarly, the Minister of Communications of Russia, a very thoughtful man, recently wrote a very, very interesting piece that was published at UNESCO, another UN affiliated, in which he talked about the importance of the ITU and of other organizations, but especially the ITU, to Russia, and the importance of the ITU should play in the area of internet, with particular focus on internet with cybersecurity, but also with a number of comments and statements that are much broader than that. So we have obviously a great set of signals about what it is we're going to be discussing. My view is we should welcome, and I'm sure we will welcome, we being the United States, both private industry, academics, NGOs, and especially the government, will welcome the dialogue. Traditionally, we always have. I think it's a very productive thing. But we need to be very focused on what it is that we are willing to agree to, and at the same time understand, have the rest of the world understand what it is we think is fundamentally wrong, and therefore things that we would not agree to. And with that, perhaps I'm happy to take questions or handle this in any way you would like to. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, I think we can all see that the United States was very well represented on telecommunications internationally for many years by Ambassador Gross. If we look domestically at efforts on Capitol Hill with respect to the internet, they're focused on issues such as taxation, intellectual property, privacy, cybersecurity, and I think it's fair to say that these are issues that domestically that Congress has had difficulty grappling with. Internationally, how does the ITU look at these issues? And of course, every country around the world is dealing with the exact same issues. And a lot of them seem to fall apart domestically, in fact, precisely because of the international character of the internet.
Yeah. Well, it is an extraordinary challenge for everyone. I think the discussions here domestically are really illustrative of how complicated and difficult these problems are. I'm always pleased when I hear policymakers here in Washington, whether at the FCC, at the State Department of Commerce, or up on Capitol Hill, recognize that many of these issues that appear domestic have very profound ramifications internationally. What we do here is viewed very closely by the international community for what is wrong, what is right, what is internet governance itself, what is the role of government, the appropriate role of governments to play. And I think it's very helpful because I think it's important. Sometimes the rhetoric is, government needs to stay out of all this stuff. And I think our discussions domestically illustrate that that's not a very persuasive talking point. That in fact, the issue really is what is the appropriate role of government and what government are we talking about? Are we talking about local governments? Are we talking about national governments? Are we talking sometimes about international multilateral organizations? And it's very important to not speak too broadly and too boldly, perhaps, in these areas and be more precise and more carefully in the way in which we think about these issues. Having said that, the ITU, in answering your question, there are two things that I think are very important for people to remember, at least two things about the ITU in this space. One is the issue we've been sort of addressing a bit, which is the ITU is a treaty-based organization. The agreements made there can have the effect of law, certainly of international law. And there have been proposals to make some of what are recommendations at the ITU. This is part of the discussions at the Wicket. There are proposals to make some of the recommendations which are precatory, that is, the ITU comes up with recommendations that can or don't have to be adopted domestically, to make them in some fashion more obligatory for countries to take. That's a huge set of issues, particularly for the United States, for U.S. industry and government. But apart from that, the ITU is a very well respected, very important organization internationally, for which I would say the majority of the world's countries, and especially the case in the developing world, look to the ITU for advice and counsel as to what policies should be adopted, what approaches should be taken. And so we I think, risk misunderstanding the nature of the world and the importance of organizations like the ITU if we only focus on the issues of sort of where they try to express some more regulatory bent as compared to their policy making. And I quickly add, as I did earlier in the talk, for the United States, it seems to me that this has been a tremendous benefit of the ITU for many of these years, where the ITU really has been very appropriately helpful and supportive of the concept of liberalization, privatization, and we've seen the benefits of that throughout the world.
I'm going to open up to the floor for questions. Please identify yourself. Gentleman in the blazer right there, yes.
Bueller?
Yep,
Okay, there we go. Seton Motley with Less Government. I want to thank you very much for your talk. You kind of touched on what I was thinking about. The internet has become a free speech, free market Xanadu with virtually no government involvement whatsoever. Isn't it internationally as simple as saying, look what is done without this? Why are we trying to make it look like everything else that's regulated and has big government involvement? And then as a side question, because as you said, they look to us and what we do, is it a little schizophrenic after we just jammed through net neutrality to then turn around and say, hey, leave the governments, leave the internet alone?
Yeah. Let me see if I can take both of those points. It is very complicated, and I don't mean to at all sound that it is easy, because obviously when governments are trying to address certain issues that I think everyone would agree are problems. Sure, let me give you spam, fraud on the internet. I mean, you can sort of tick down. Piracy, I think everyone would agree. What to do about it is the complication, but everyone would agree it's a problem. I mean, there's a whole host of legitimate concerns. I mean, the internet in some respects is no different than the real world. You have the cyber world and the real world. What's wrong in the real world is often wrong in the cyber world and vice versa. So I think, that means there's a role for government. One of the points I think that is often lost in the discussion is we sort of have rhetoric rather than more deeper discussion sometimes, is that there is a role for government to play. The question really is whose government and the nature of what that is. Where I come from, less is more. Freedom is extraordinarily important. The ability to innovate without unnecessary governmental intervention is important. But that is not the same as saying that government doesn't play a role. In fact, let me give you another example that is often overlooked. And that is, in our discussions about the internet, the issue of rule of law is profoundly important in my view, whether it's in terms of making sure that countries have an enabling environment for the build-out of internet services to begin with, for the investments to be made and so forth. There are, at the risk of stating the obvious, an extraordinarily important role for governments in that area. Similarly, in terms of education, I could sort of tick down a whole series of these things. But that's not to be confused that governments should control the sort of things that you were referring to and others. And that balance is a very delicate one. And I don't suggest at all that that balance is a universal one. I think there are some universal truths that need to be. Free flow of information, the rights of individuals to have access, and so forth are extraordinarily important. But I don't necessarily think that every country needs to handle these things all the same way. If I may, at least when I used to be in government, one of the things that gave me some comfort, and maybe one of the sort of ways that helped me think about these things, is different countries deal with these issues in different ways. Democracies make different choices in different ways, and I'm basically comfortable even if a country decides to do something that I think is not what I would want. But if it's in a democratic and transparent fashion, that seems like a prima facie a fairly reasonable thing. Where I worry are non-democratic regimes making these types of decisions, so-called in the best interest of their people, to keep them from information, to keep the problems at bay, and so forth. That's where, in my experience, it's much harder to justify and to understand. That answer the question? Right. Well, let me not answer by answering the question, or answer the question and not answer at the same time. Partly, I'm not in government. I haven't been in government for 3 years, so I don't want to speak for the government, our government, in terms of any recent discussions that they have had. Let me answer the question by saying when I was in government, any potential inconsistency was thrown at me extraordinarily fast. It's one of the great things about the internet. Everyone knows everything. That's at least if they want to, especially about our political process.
Here in the...
Hi, Juliana Grunwald with National Journal. Do you expect there'll be another move by some countries to transfer the DNS management functions now done by ICANN to the ITU? And also, do you think the recent controversy over ICANN's push to roll out an unlimited number of new top-level domains sort of provided fodder for that effort or fuel for that effort?
I can tell you what people have talked about to date. It's always difficult to speculate as to what's going to happen going forward. In terms of ICANN, I think there has been a number of proposals, but I wouldn't want to overstate it. There have been some suggestions that some addressing characteristics, some numbering / addressing work, such as the rollout of IPv6 and so forth, perhaps should better be done by the ITU. I'm not sure I would want to overstate that. I'm not sure that's really captured many people's imagination right now. So I think the probability of that class of thing happening is fairly small. Nothing is ever zero, but I think it's, that doesn't keep me up very much at night right now. I think obviously ICANN itself is going through a transformation. Will have a new CEO. I think that how they deal with, how the new leadership deals with these classes of issues, the uneasy relationship, I think it's fair to say, between governments through the Government Advisory Committee with that organization will be a source of great focus by whomever has the honor of leading that organization. And we'll just have to see. Clearly, as long as governments feel, quite naturally, if governments feel that on important issues of the day, particularly public policy related issues, that they're not being listened to or obeyed in some cases, then you have the possibility that they'll look to figure out how to do this in some other fashion. Those have been proposals not just at the ITU, but there are proposals for some of those things to be taken over, as I said, at the UN itself. There are lots of proposals out there. That's not necessarily the same thing as something about to happen.
Question here? Let's wait till we have a microphone.
Right.
Institute. Are there differences on these issues between America and Europe and within the Western Alliance proper?
let me again, since I'm no longer in government, I don't want to make it look like I am speaking on behalf of anybody other than David Gross in this case. But based on my conversations, there is a strong desire for the U.S. and its European allies to be on the same page. There are meetings that were held this week at CEPT, for example, that are discussing some of these related issues. But I don't want to be too sanguine about it because, you know, when the actual proposals are put forward, when negotiations are taking place, my experience is every country has its own unique set of rules and perspectives and so forth, and finding common ground, finding that consensus is part of that process. So I think it would be, on the one hand, sort of too easy to say yes because we share so much in our views that it's not going to be a problem. I don't think it's going to be a problem in the sense of some other countries perhaps being a bigger problem. But nevertheless, it's, we shouldn't assume that everyone's going to be on the same page on all issues going forward. And that's whether that's telephony issues or internet-related issues.
Here and then.
Thank you very much. Peter Shutley from Brookings. Two related questions. The first is a technical one. You mentioned several times this multi-stakeholder approach.
Right.
And my question is a technical detail, the nature of our delegation. Will it be just government officials or will it be mixed government, corporate, NGOs? And my second question is related within the U.S. government. Could you share with us, please, maybe two or the three biggest differences of views between different government agencies?
Well, let me easily answer the first and cautiously answer the second. The tradition, the proud and long tradition of the U.S. government in this area has been to have a very diverse set of players on the U.S. delegation. Traditionally, those delegations have been made up of government officials from various agencies. I feel confident that that will be the case here. And also from companies, NGOs, I imagine there'll be technical organizations represented. The piece that I think is often underappreciated technically on this, and so that I am sure, without speaking on their behalf, I am sure that that tradition will continue. And in fact, let me just say that I've been very impressed and very proud, if you can be proud of your government, about how welcoming they have all been to have people come in and have discussions with them to understand individual concerns and the like, whether it's State Department, NTIA, the FCC, and others. It's really been very, very good. The sort of technical piece, though, is when you are a member of the U.S. delegation, you are committed to the U.S. view on all relevant issues, period, full stop. And if you represent a company or have some divergence from that, that is a problem. That is, you should not be on that delegation, because one of the problems, having led a lot of these delegations, one of the problems you always have is you need to speak with one voice. You have 193 countries at the ITU. It's hard enough to understand what everyone's position is, no less trying to decipher who's speaking on what issues for whom. And so that becomes a very important set of issues. In terms of, yeah, I would say, you know, frankly, I haven't seen any light between any of the agencies, and none of the agencies have suggested to me, and I've had many conversations, that there is. I think that, you know, there are always questions about timing and approach and so forth. Those are tactics, not overall strategy and not fundamental positions. I am hopeful and cautiously optimistic, but very hopeful that the U.S. government will announce soon who the head of delegation will be, and that they start to move from the preliminary process that we've been in now, which is very typical, to the early stages of forming the delegation, so that we have, as a country, positions, and we can start doing the sorts of things you always do naturally as part of a treaty negotiation.
We have a question up here, and then Mr. Brennan.
Thanks. I'm Beatrice Covassi from the European Union delegation here in Washington, D.C. And it seems from what you say, David, that 2012, as we know, is going to be a very defining year for the future of the internet. And I would agree that on many issues, especially as we see not only BRICS, but new developing countries coming up front on the stage, there is a desire to be on the same page, to have at least coherent approaches, although not always identical maybe, but still, to go towards third countries with the same kind of grand design or common objectives. Yet sometimes I don't feel, and this is my personal impression, it's not the EU delegation impression, of course, don't take it wrongly, but I don't feel an urgency in the transatlantic relationship. And my personal belief is that we should have a bit more of an urgency in stressing the importance of the transatlantic relationship, because this would make us stronger on the negotiating table, especially in the international arena, vis-à-vis third countries who don't share the same common set of values. So what could we do, in your view, if you agree, and what could be done to make this important year even more, fundamental and more helpful for both of us? Both sides of the pond?
I think that's a very important component. I mean, at the risk of sounding cliche-ish, I mean, when you have challenges, as we do, in this area particularly, there are lots of opportunities, and there are lots of ability for people to reach out. So let me give you a domestic equivalent. This is, as one of the couple of the questions before indicated, it's no surprise, and actually it's very, very important, that we have within the United States many different perspectives on many important issues. I mean, whether traditional telephone companies versus internet service providers versus the content people and so forth. That's to be expected. That's a very good thing. My experience on these issues, particularly when they come to internet-related issues, is that the United States is extraordinarily unified, that there is a sense of commonality of what that future ought to be. I was extraordinarily pleased back in 2005, before the Tunis phase of the World Summit, that we had a unanimous sense of the Congress come out in support of the U.S. government's position. That's not that long ago, and it was unanimous, and that was very important. It was very useful as we had discussions with other governments in explaining how unified the U.S. would be. I would expand that to the extent we can, and I realize that you don't want to be too paper over differences that should be there. But this is another great example of where we can use this process as a way of continuing that closeness of that relationship. I don't purport to be able to speak on whether or not it's closer or further apart than it ought to be, but there's always opportunities for improvement, and the commonalities are so strong. The economics are so strong that there ought to be a lot of ways of bringing us together.
Thank you. Dan Brenner with Hogan Lovells. Something that I hadn't fully appreciated until I heard your presentation, David, was the role of the 1987 treaty and the fact that the way that the ITU works is that that's going to be in the opening file of whoever convenes the assembly, that they're going to say, well, we're here to rewrite this or consider changes to it. And a lot of that, as you pointed out, was telephony, and almost all of it was. And back in 87,
88, by the way.
Actually, 88. Thanks. Settlements were front and center for developing countries and the people who may have the most votes in the room. Settlements was a very important part of the international telephone order, and since then, a lot of that has devolved into trying to reduce international settlements or privatizing them, so that it's reduced the cost of international calling, plus innovations like IP. So to what extent, if I'm a delegate from a developing country, well, I certainly care and should care about these internet issues a lot. I'm also probably under there may be somebody who whispers in my ear before I fly off to the meeting in Dubai, see what you can do about increasing revenues out of this process, whether it's telephone settlements or the peering arrangements. I'd like you to come back with some revenue out of this process.
Well, actually, those pressures are real, and you're right about the shift. A couple of quick points in response. One is the Secretary General of the ITU, Hamadoun Touré, has spoken a number of times about his vision of what should be the focus of the wicket. And he has, in his view, he thinks that the wicket ought not to be about internet governance. I think I'm not putting words in his mouth. And I think he's been very clear that he thinks it ought to be about other things. Obviously, part of the issue is that line drawing between what is internet governance, if it's just ITU doing something that ICANN does, that's one thing. But if you're talking about things that affect the price and availability and innovation in terms of the internet space, that's a different thing. And along those lines, he believes, and he's been quite outspoken, that what ought to be the focus of these discussions is, in his view, that because the internet runs on over telephony lines in many cases, that carriers and others need to have an economic incentive to be able to build out. And in his view, he's gone so far, at least I think it was in Brazil last year, so far as to say that if there isn't a change, we could have a disaster as early as 2015 in terms of the infrastructure because of the growth of internet traffic and so forth. So his view is that there needs to be a discussion about the economics associated with that. My personal view is I don't think that's correct. I think that the myriad of arrangements, the amounts of investment going forward and the like in that space is really quite extraordinary and has continued to be extraordinary. He points to, in some of his speeches, the financial industry and the problems they had in 2008 and 2009 as, in his view, an example of too little governmental regulation of an important space, and believes that that is the high-tech community needs to be careful to make sure that that doesn't happen. And in his view, I think it's fair to say he believes that there ought to be some international rules governing some of these things. As I said, I think that's, in my view, that's not correct. I think we're actually doing quite well. And as I look around the world, particularly in the developing world, I see the amounts of investment that are truly extraordinary. I think probably unprecedented in human history in this area itself. And that it doesn't require any international set of rules here. Obviously, each country makes its decision about how it wants to run its domestic system, but in terms of international telephony, the amount of submarine cable capacity continues to expand extraordinarily fast. The technology continues to develop very, very rapidly as well. So there will be pressures, I'm sure. As I said, the Secretary General, I think, has been quite explicit about that. So there will certainly be a lot of discussion about it. How that's going to get worked out, come to Dubai and find out.
Okay. One more question, and I think we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. Jerry Udwin with the Udwin Group. David, if we're not just looking too much for trouble in the sense of the question that I'm asking, but in terms of the international economic situation, and especially Europe's continuing difficulties, what opportunities or dangers does that present toward having a unified front to do the right things at Dubai against a backdrop of countries in great peril and difficulty financially?
Well, I'm not sure there's a very direct tie there. I mean, obviously, when countries are in distress, economic distress, it's a difficult time. I think it actually probably goes more to the point I was making just a moment ago to Dan's question, which is I think it probably depends a little bit on what lessons are taken away from those experiences. And far be it from me to say to those who are living through it what lessons they ought to take away from these things. I think if some sense is that there needs to be greater international regulation of international things writ large, whether it's the financial area or others, some may be tempted to go down a more regulatory path and think that that was the right way to go. If, on the other hand, that others look at that and say, no, that's not correct, that in fact it's perhaps the other lesson, that is trying to do things across borders in too common a way, whether it be a currency or otherwise, is wrong. Maybe you come out with a very different view. I guess my sense is, in this area, I would be very cautious to draw any connections to any of these things. I think that we have enough of a sense of what has worked and what the challenges are to figure out which way we ought to go going forward in this space, or spaces perhaps associated with it. And I think that ultimately is probably going to be the most important thing. But having said that, let me say, one of the lessons I learned, and I think everybody who is involved in negotiations, particularly international negotiations, you learn very quickly, is you can't fight something with nothing. And by that I mean, in this case, many people would look at the situation and say, what's the problem? I mean, that was sort of implicit in some of the questions we've gotten today. And if the answer is there's really not a big problem, if it's not broken, don't fix it sort of problem. The problem is that that's not the universal view, that there are legitimate, I think, views, and even if they're not legitimate, they're certainly well-held views by other governments that there are things that need to be done. And so the just say no approach is ultimately not a bad way to start, but it's probably not where you end up. And the key but also to be clear, just because you're not just saying no doesn't mean you're agreeing to anything that's wrong. And in fact, what you do is you're looking at these things as an opportunity, whether it's a transatlantic opportunity or any other opportunity for improvement. What can be improved? I mean, I don't think anybody sits anywhere and says that a treaty negotiated in 1988 is so perfect in an area that has changed so radically that there isn't something that can be done to make things better. The key is in improving these things, whatever that turns out to be, ought to be done with certain core values. And I'm absolutely convinced the U.S. government will, as it always has, be true to those core values, be clear in expressing them, and will only agree to something that is true to them.
With that, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Great job. Thank you.